The afternoon sun beat down like a hammer, burning every breath of air into dust. Clara stood trembling at the edge of the road, stripped of everything but her shame. Three men, her late husband's kin, had made a spectacle of her ruin, parading their cruelty as if it were justice. Their wagon stood behind them, the boards stained with sweat and scorn, while their eyes glittered with the cold satisfaction of men who believed possession was the same as right. Into this harsh tableau rode Thomas. The words he spoke were not a question, not even a command, but a fact carved in stone. "You're coming with me." He dismounted with the fluid confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing left to fear. Dust clung to his boots, to his coat, to the hard set of his jaw, but his gaze never left Clara. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though refusing to acknowledge either her tormentors or her rescuer. One of the men spat into the dirt, his voice sharp as broken flint. "She's ours. Debt paid in flesh. You've no claim here, Thomas." The venom in his words hung heavy, a doctrine of ownership dressed as family honor. But Thomas did not waste himself on rebuttal. He moved with deliberate silence, pulling the thick wool blanket from his saddle. His hands were steady, respectful, as he draped it across Clara's bare shoulders, careful not to touch her skin. Then he turned to face the three men. His voice was low, unshaken, carrying the finality of a door slamming shut. "Get off my land!" The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. In that moment, the line was drawn, not just in dust and dirt, but in dignity reclaimed. The road stretched wide and merciless under the sinking sun, but within the steady rhythm of hooves, there was a fragile pocket of calm. Clara sat before Thomas on the saddle, her body wrapped in the rough wool blanket, her back pressed lightly against the unyielding wall of his chest. Each rise and fall of the horse carried them further from the scene of her humiliation. The creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on parched earth, these became the cadence of a silence that sheltered her. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, she wasn't bracing for another hand raised in cruelty. Thomas did not speak, did not press her with questions or promises he couldn't keep. His silence was not neglect. It was refuge. It was space enough for her to gather the broken fragments of herself without fear of interruption or judgment. The land around them seemed to echo her inner state. The horizon bled with the brutal colors of sunset orange crimson, the hues of a fresh wound painted across the western sky. The sagebrush whispered as the wind passed through, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain. Every detail pressed against Clara's senses, but Thomas himself was a still point in the chaos, his presence steady as the land itself. She allowed herself just for a moment to lean into that steadiness. Her heartbeat, once frantic, began to find the same rhythm as the horse's gait. Yet peace was fragile. As the twilight deepened, her eyes caught a faint glimmer in the distance, a lantern no larger than a spark in the immense dark. A destination, a house, a place she had not chosen, but one she was now being carried toward. The sight of it pierced the cocoon of silence. Fear, sharp and familiar, coiled in her chest. What waited for her there? Another cage, another debt disguised as kindness. The red sky behind them seemed to whisper of wounds that never healed, and the tiny flame ahead flickered like a promise she was too afraid to trust. Still the horse carried on, and Thomas's silence did not waver. Between the fading day and the coming night, Clara sat in that uncertain space, suspended between ruin and the fragile, terrifying hope of something different. The valley opened before them like a hidden bowl, sheltered by ridges that cut the wind and held the evening light in softer tones. Nestled at its center stood Thomas's ranch, sturdy, unadorned buildings that looked less like they had been built than coaxed from the earth itself. A barn, a web of fences, and a modest house with smoke faintly curling from its chimney formed a quiet refuge against the wilderness. When the horse halted, Clara made to slide down, but her legs betrayed her. Thomas swung off first and turned to her, his arms rising with practiced certainty. He lifted her down carefully, his calloused hands circling her waist for only as long as it took for her feet to find the ground. For a moment she faltered, knees weak, and he steadied her until she could stand on her own. There was no presumption in the gesture, only the kind of respect that restores what cruelty has tried to strip away. Inside the house was simple but meticulous. A stone hearth, swept clean, dominated one wall, its scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. Handmade chairs and a rough-hewn table bore the marks of long use, but they were sound reliable. Thomas pointed to a closed door. "That room is yours," he said evenly. "Clothes are on the bed. They were my mother's." Clara entered and found a dress and shift folded neatly on a quilt. They smelled of lye soap and sunlight, a far cry from the dirt and shame clinging to the wool blanket. She shed the last remnant of her humiliation and slipped into the clean garments. Though loose on her frame, they covered her with something far heavier than fabric dignity. For the first time since the road, she felt shielded. When she returned, the hearth crackled with new fire, and on the table were 2 plates of beans and bacon. Thomas had moved about the small kitchen with quiet purpose, his actions efficient, his presence unassuming. They sat across from each other, the silence between them unbroken, save for the scrape of tin forks and the sigh of the flames. He did not ask her name. He did not demand her story. His kindness sought no repayment, no explanation. It was enough in that moment to eat in peace. For Clara, the simple act of sitting at a table, clothed and fed without condition, was more than comfort. It was the first fragile step back toward belonging. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm as steady as the rising sun. Thomas rose before dawn, the muted thud of his boots across the floorboards, the only sound that marked his leaving. He worked the land with tireless devotion, mending fences, tending cattle, hauling water, yet never once intruded upon Clara's solitude. Each morning without comment, he left food on the table, a piece of bread, a bowl of stew, or a strip of dried meat. It was sustenance offered without expectation, proof that care could exist without demands. Clara remained mostly within the walls of the small house, exploring the quiet corners of the life that had become hers. The rooms were spare, but each item carried a weight of meaning. On a shelf, she discovered a small collection of carved wooden birds, their edges smooth from the patient work of careful hands. Against the wall rested a faded photograph of a stern woman, whose eyes mirrored Thomas's, his mother, she guessed. And on the windowsill sat a chipped porcelain teacup, its handle long broken. Its uselessness was strangely comforting. It was cracked, yet still kept its shape like her, perhaps no longer whole, but not destroyed. By mid-afternoon one day, the air inside felt too close, too heavy. Clara stepped hesitantly onto the porch, the brightness of the Arizona sun sharp against her eyes. She stood there quietly breathing the clean air, watching the dust swirl and the chickens peck at the earth. Out in the distance, Thomas was repairing a section of fence. She knew he saw her. His hammer paused mid-strike. His shoulders shifted, but he did not turn, did not make her presence into a spectacle. Instead, he carried on with his work, granting her the dignity of simply being. It was a small moment, yet profound, the first time Clara had chosen to meet the world beyond her room, and Thomas, by not claiming it, allowed it to belong entirely to her. It was late in the afternoon when Clara noticed it, just a speck against the eastern ridge, too deliberate to be chance. A lone rider sat mounted in a place no man had reason to be watching, waiting. Though the distance was great, she knew in her bones who it was. The Graysons, her late husband's kin, the ones who had stripped her dignity in the open sun. Even from afar, their presence felt like a hand closing around her throat. The figure lingered nearly an hour, unmoving, a shadow of ownership that refused to die before disappearing back over the rise. The valley that had seemed a refuge now felt fragile, its silence more like a cage than a sanctuary. Clara drew the blanket tighter around herself, the weight of her past pressing heavily on her chest. That night, when the wind shifted and the lantern hissed, Thomas did something she had not yet seen. He unrolled a piece of oiled cloth on the table, disassembled his rifle, and began to clean it with slow, deliberate care. The scrape of metal against brush, the careful reassembly of each part, these were not the actions of a man seeking violence, but of one who knew violence might soon come. He did not mention the rider on the ridge. He did not look at Clara as he worked. Yet the message was clear, he had seen it too. He was preparing. Sitting quietly by the hearth, her hands tight in her lap, Clara realized something she had not dared to hope. Thomas's protection was not an impulsive gesture born of pity. It was a choice, a commitment carried with the same quiet weight as his work on the land. Whatever came over that ridge, he intended to stand between it and her for as long as it took. The storm came sudden, rolling down from the north with a low moan that rattled the windows and bent the trees. Rain pelted the roof in heavy bursts, and the house seemed to shrink under the force of the wind. Thomas was already pulling on his boots when the sound pierced through the storm, a desperate panic bleeding from the lambing pen. Without hesitation, he grabbed the lantern, the glass globe clutched firm in his calloused hand. He did not look back as he pushed into the night, but Clara, driven by something she couldn't name, followed. The yard was chaos, wind, lashing mud, thick underfoot shadows, writhing in the lantern glow. They reached the small pen where a ewe struggled in the straw, her sides heaving, her legs trembling. Thomas knelt immediately, his movements sure and calm despite the storm. His voice was low, steady, coaxing the panicked animal, as though she might understand. Clara stood frozen at the gate, her heart hammering, until he jerked his head toward her. "Hold this!" He thrust the lantern into her hands. She caught it clumsily, but when her fingers closed around the warm glass, something in her steadied. She knelt opposite him, the rain plastering her hair against her cheeks, the storm trying to snuff out the fragile flame. Yet she kept the light steady, angling it so his hands could work. Thomas's focus was absolute. He turned the lamb inside the ewe, working with a precision born of long familiarity. The minutes stretched like hours, each breath of the animal a question mark. Then with a final pull, the small body slid free, slick, still frighteningly silent. For one awful heartbeat, the world held still. The storm, the wind, even Clara's own breath seemed to vanish into that hollow pause. Then Thomas rubbed the lamb hard with burlap, his large hands coaxing life into the tiny form. A shudder ran through its body, followed by a weak, broken cry. Clara gasped, the sound tearing through her chest. The ewe nosed her newborn alive and trembling, but alive. Relief flooded the pen like sudden sunlight, though the rain still hammered down. For the first time since she had come here, Clara did not feel like a burden carried into safety. She felt like part of the fight. Together they had pulled life from the edge, shared in a small miracle born of mud rain and stubborn will. She looked up and found Thomas watching her across the lantern light. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered longer than habit allowed, as if acknowledging her place beside him. When they returned to the house, dripping and exhausted, the storm still raging, Clara broke the silence herself. She stood in the warm glow of the fire, wrapped in one of his blankets, and whispered two simple words. "Thank you." It was not gratitude for a roof, or food, or even rescue. It was for letting her stand beside him when life hung in the balance, for trusting her hands to hold the light steady. Thomas only nodded, but in that moment the silence between them was no longer heavy, it was shared. And for the first time Clara felt she might belong. The days after the storm carried a new rhythm, softer but steadier. Clara began to step outside on her own, her bare feet pressing into the damp earth, her hands reaching for weeds tangled in the small neglected garden behind the house. At first the movements were uncertain, more instinct than skill, but the soil gave her something solid to hold. Each root pulled free steadied her trembling fingers, and with every fistful of earth, the tremor inside her lessened. Near the fence, she discovered a wild sprig of mint, stubborn and fragrant, growing against the odds. She tended it carefully as though it were a secret entrusted only to her. A few days later, when Thomas came in from the fields, he found a glass of cool mint water waiting on the porch rail. He paused, eyes flicking from the glass to Clara, sitting quietly on the steps. Without words, he lifted it, drank, and nodded once. It was thanks enough between them. Gratitude did not need to be spoken aloud. Clara's small acts multiplied. She threaded a needle and mended the tear in his work shirt with even stitches, swept the wooden floors until they gleamed placed order where there had been neglect. These were not the duties of a servant nor gestures of obligation. They were her way of piecing together a new life, of saying, without saying, that she wanted to belong here. Every nail hammered, every stitch sewn, was a root taking hold, not just for her, but for the life they were quietly beginning to share. That evening, Clara's voice finally broke the long silence. She sat by the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the flames as if they could burn away the memory. Her words came steady, stripped of pleading or self-pity, only the raw edges of fact. She told Thomas about her husband, kind, gentle, but too weak to stand against the world. Fever had taken him swiftly, leaving her a widow, with nothing but debts she had no power to pay. The Graysons, her husband's kin, had seen her not as family, but as a failed investment, another mouth to feed, another burden dragging their fortunes down. They claimed the farm seized the livestock, And when there was nothing left to take, they chose to strip away her last defense, her dignity. They dragged her into the sun and left her bare, before strangers a cruel lesson etched into her body and soul. As her voice faded, the fire popped, and the silence between them grew heavy. Thomas did not interrupt, did not speak to soften the sharp edges of her story. His eyes stayed on the hearth, but the muscle in his jaw clenched tight, releasing only to clench again. His silence was not indifference. It was the weight of fury pressed down, forged into something harder than rage. He could not undo what had been stolen from her, but in that moment he made a vow without words. As long as she stood under his roof, the cruelty of others would never touch her again. The ridge to the east darkened against the bruised sky, and Clara's hands gripped the railing of the porch until her knuckles went white. Three riders crested the rise, grim, deliberate shapes, moving with the same cruel purpose as before. Thomas saw them before she spoke. He did not shout, did not curse. His voice was low but absolute. "Go inside." She hesitated, fear widening her eyes. He repeated, softer this time but no less commanding, "Go." And she obeyed, slipping behind the door, leaving it slightly ajar, her presence lingering like a prayer. The three Graysons rode into the yard, horses, kicking up dust that swirled in the rising wind. Their father sat tallest, his face carved from meanness, flanked by two brutish sons bred on arrogance and whiskey. The old man's sneered, thin voice, sharp as a whip. "We've come for what's ours, Abel. The woman, send her out." Thomas stood at the top step, broad-shouldered, and still the storm's gathering weight at his back. His reply cut through the gusting wind. "She's not yours." One of the sons swung down rope, coiled in his fist, a grin like a knife. "She is by law, by right, and we mean to take her." Thomas's answer was as steady as the ground beneath him. "She stays." The younger son lunged fast but clumsy, trying to reach the porch. In a single movement, Thomas met him halfway, body striking like an oak breaking in the wind. The boy went sprawling into the dirt, rope falling useless from his hand. The father and the remaining son reached for their belts, steel glinting under the thundercloud sky. But then Thomas raised his head, eyes burning with a cold fire that froze them where they sat astride. The silence stretched heavy, unyielding, broken only by the first distant crack of thunder. His words came like a verdict. "Leave, and don't come back." It was not a threat. It was prophecy. The Graysons saw it in his stance, in the storm gathering behind his voice. The father spat, but it was hollow now, fear hidden beneath bluster. They dragged their fallen kin onto his horse and turned retreating into the darkness. Their angry shouts were swallowed whole by the sky as rain split open above sheets of water, cleansing the dust, washing away the echo of their cruelty. Clara stepped out, then no longer trembling. The storm beat down, but on her face there was only freedom. And for the first time, Thomas felt that the valley was no longer a battleground, but a sanctuary earned, defended, and made whole by the choice to stand. The storm passed, leaving the air rinsed, clean, sharp, with the scent of sage and wet earth. What had felt like a cage for weeks was suddenly transformed into something new, lighter, freer. The Graysons were gone, their shadows washed away, and what remained was the steady rhythm of two lives slowly finding alignment. Thomas and Clara began to move in quiet partnership. Where once she lingered on the edges of the house, she now stepped into the day beside him. She patched torn shingles on the roof while he steadied the ladder, her hands firm, his silent trust unspoken. She checked the fences with him, learning which posts to tighten, how to spot a weak line. Their work was not divided, but shared an unspoken choreography that made even the hardest labor seem less lonely. Small gestures became their language. In the mornings, she sometimes found a single wildflower left on the table, its fragile stem in a chipped jar. He never mentioned it, never asked if she noticed, but she always did. In the evenings, as they sat on the porch, Thomas would point wordlessly at the hawk circling high above the valley, his finger lifting toward the sky. And Clara would follow his gaze, finding in that simple act a sense of being seen, of being welcomed into a world that was no longer his alone. One afternoon, when he returned from the pastures, something new waited by the kitchen window. The broken porcelain teacup she had once discovered, an emblem of her own fractured life, had been mended by her careful hands. The cracks remained fine lines dark against the glaze, but the cup was whole again. And inside she had placed a cluster of small purple wildflowers, their color vivid against the pale ceramic. Thomas stood still for a long moment, the weight of the day sliding from his shoulders. His rough fingers brushed a petal delicate as breath. When he turned, Clara was watching him unsure, and then he smiled, slow, genuine, transforming his weathered face. It was the first time. In that moment, the house ceased to be his alone. It became their home, a place pieced back together like the cup, scarred, but beautiful, fragile yet strong. The seasons turned with quiet certainty, each one etching its story onto the land and onto the two souls who now called the valley home. Autumn wrapped the hills in gold fields, readying for rest. Winter laid its stark white silence across the rooftops, snow muting the world to a hush. Then came spring, tender and green, pulling new life from the soil. Through it all, Thomas and Clara lived side by side, their days written not in words but in the rhythm of labor, respect, and a silence that had softened into comfort. Every fence mended, every field tended, every meal shared around the rough wooden table became a chapter in their shared story. It was not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like roots deepening into the earth, binding them to the land and slowly to each other. They did not need declarations or grand promises. The way Thomas left his gloves neatly by the door so she would not trip over them, or the way Clara set aside a portion of stew knowing he'd come in late from the fields, these were their vows. Yet the past was not erased. It lingered in small ways, like the fine cracks in the porcelain teacup resting on the windowsill. Clara had pieced it together with patient hands, the lines still visible, impossible to ignore. But instead of shame, those scars had become proof of endurance. Just as the teacup held water again, so too did their lives hold purpose and quiet strength. The fractures did not diminish them. They revealed the courage it took to begin again. Strength is not always the loudest voice in the room, nor the sharpest weapon raised in defiance. True strength, the kind that lasts, is quiet. It is steady like the mountains on the horizon, unmoving, unshaken, not because they are untouched by storms, but because they endure them without complaint. Thomas embodied this kind of power. He did not shout, he did not posture. He did the right thing because it was right, and that was enough. His conviction was its own form of law, older and truer than any papers the Graysons could wave. But strength is not only measured in the man who stands guard, it also lives in the woman who dares to rebuild herself from ruin. Clara's journey was not made of grand gestures. It was shaped in the smallest, bravest acts, her hands in the soil pulling weeds, her quiet offering of a mint drink on the porch, the delicate stitches mending a shirt. Every act said, "I am still here. I am more than what was taken from me." In choosing to face the world again, even one step at a time, she transformed her shame into resilience. Together, their lives became a testament to a deeper truth. Sanctuaries are not found, they are built. And they are built not of stone walls or locked doors, but of kindness, quietly given trust, slowly earned, and love that grows in the spaces where silence is safe. Theirs was a holy ground not marked by church bells or written deeds, but by the dignity of two souls refusing to be defined by cruelty. In the harsh expanse of the frontier, where land was fought over and people discarded like scraps, Thomas and Clara created something different. They showed that gentleness can be stronger than fists, that healing can grow from scars, and that even in the loneliest deserts of life, a home can be born where courage and compassion meet. This is the lesson that lingers. Strength is not noise, nor violence, nor the weight of possession. It is the quiet integrity of a man who shields and the quiet bravery of a woman who begins again. And when those strengths meet, they carve out a sanctuary, an oasis of love in the wilderness of a broken world.